Our next speaker is Michelle Johnston from the National Association of State Boating Law Administrators Vessel Identification, Registration, and Titling Committee. She's going to talk about the challenges that states have with registering and numbering illegally imported boats.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Johnston. I work in the Utah Titling Registration Department. I currently serve as the chair for NASBLA's Vessel Identification, Registration, and Titling Committee, commonly known as VERT. Thank you for inviting me in order to come together to focus on this important topic. I am here to speak from the state agency's title registration perspective. We cannot solve the influx of illegal boats or inspect every boat alone, but we can assure vessel integrity. The state counters are seeing vessels with unverifiable compliance that are being purchased by private citizens. As we know, illegal imported recreational vessels often do not have proper documentation and required hull identification numbers. These types of vessels frequently do not meet safety standards. Increased internet and third-party sales on these types of vessels have increasingly been on the rise and is compounding the problem. Private citizens that are purchasing the vessels, usually unknowingly, are asking the states to solve a problem that should have been prevented. The states have a vital role to verify that the HIN registrations and documentations are authentic and unaltered. Under 33 CFR 174.16, as of January 1st, 2017, before issuing, renewing, or updating ownership information on the certificate of number for a vessel imported or manufactured on or after November 1st, 1972, the issuing authority must determine whether the vessel has a primary HIN, meeting the requirements of the 33 CFR Part 181 subpart C. If the vessel does not have a compliant primary HIN, the issuing authority must assign a primary HIN and verify that the owner has permanently affixed it. This is done by bringing the vessel to the state counters, sometimes having a police officer verified at the owner's home, and they just bring the documentation with them. A main purpose of a HIN is to identify vessels that may not comply with recreational vessel safety regulations. So the state counters are seeing illegally imported vessels where the HIN has a matching US format, the 12-digit format, but the MIC does not match the United States Coast Guard's manufacturer. Some non-US manufacturers are copying MICs that might not be detected by state agencies. Since the states do not have the infrastructure to perform full compliance verifications, the Z number that is issued is strictly just a number, and it's not any kind of declaration of safety or seaworthiness. Because of this, NASBLA's VERT best practice for self-imported vessels warn that the Z number creates a loophole, and if a major safety issue arises, there may not be valid importer and therefore no ability for the Coast Guard to conduct a recall. The states don't want to be a contributing factor to loopholes. This is why proper communication and training is vital for the states. Employees come and go and don't always pass on their knowledge that they have gained within their tenure. VERT is diligent in recruiting states to utilize resources available to guide them with public policies and recreational boating safety. It is very disheartening when a consumer spends their hard-earned money, sometimes thousands of dollars, and we have to inform them that we cannot issue a con or a HIN. They vent their frustrations out on the frontline counter employees. We don't like turning customers away, and the customers don't necessarily understand the full impact of why rules are set into place, and it's for safety. It is not uncommon to see a buyer being turned around away from our counters because they don't meet the requirements. So they're turning around and they're selling this vessel to another person unknowingly, does not know that it doesn't meet the standards. And so that person is coming in and trying to register the vehicle or the vessel as well. So the cycle tends to continue if it just gets passed on to the next consumer. So 3 words to think about: verification, documentation, and escalating. So verify meaning states implement consistent HIN verifications by following the 33 CFR 174.16. This also means verifying the MIC against the Coast Guard's manufacturer's identification database as part of the process. If the MIC does not match, the state should not be issuing a Z number and should be contacting the Coast Guard for direction and guidance from them. Documenting, meaning using a documentation packet, including a self-import affidavit. NASBLA has a best practice that gives detailed information on steps to take in order to issue a Z number and certificate number. This includes bills of sales, photos, affidavits, shipping documents, just to name a few. Escalating means states have a consistent avenue for assistance when encountering non-compliance vehicles. The guidance needs to come from a single source. This helps ensure consistency and accuracy, so we're all doing it the same way. In closing, I encourage state issuing authorities to ensure they are following the 33 CFR 174.16 concerning HIN verification. Training staff on validating MICs using the Coast Guard's manufacturer identification database, follow NASBLA's self-import affidavit best practice, and finally issue Z numbers duly and in limited circumstances. The states encourage support from the federal and industry spaces, enhanced training, consistent messaging to consumers, and clear documentation at the point of sale and entry are valid for success of the states. Thank you. I am grateful to play whatever role I can in working together to protect boaters and strengthen boating safety nationwide.
Our next speaker is Jason Bartholomew. He is from the U.S. Coast Guard Sector Detroit, and he's going to provide a case study on the impact of illegally imported boats.
So we responded to a report from the Coast Guard Investigative Service regarding an importation of Chinese vessels into the Sector Detroit area. The Coast Guard Investigative Service was primarily looking at the importation nexus and worked with Customs to determine the actual potentially fraudulent import and or registration of the vessels to include assignment of HIN numbers through the state of Michigan. So after that investigation concluded with CGIS and Customs, they decided not to pursue that criminally and forwarded that to us at the Coast Guard sector within the prevention department. So what occurred was there was an importation of 4 jet type kit vessels, or more or less like car boats, that were purchased from a Michigan resident in the Detroit area from a Chinese amusement manufacturer, likely using like a Temu or an Alibaba type account. Those vessels were purchased online along with trailers and were basically imported, somewhat assembled, but not fully assembled. The vessels arrived in the port of Detroit sometime in 2024. And from there, they spent some time in the port for whatever reason, I'm not quite certain, but eventually landed at Riverside Marina in Detroit, Michigan, where final assembly was accomplished by the purchaser and one of his cohorts. So, the thing is that the importation then essentially bypassed a facility bearing a manufacturer identification code. So with that, the purchaser and the other individual had run into an issue with vessel registration. So to overcome that issue, what they did was went to the Secretary of State, which in Michigan is similar to DMV in other parts of the country. And they presented the documentation that they had And the purchaser's accomplice basically presented to the Secretary of State that these were home built type vessels. It's not uncommon in the state of Michigan for the Secretary of State personnel to potentially not be familiar with what is a home built vessel, what entails, and what type of registration or hull identification number would need to be assigned because they didn't have hull identification numbers. So a mistake was made in our opinion and the state of Michigan opinion that the vessels were allowed to be registered and assign hull identification numbers with a Z-type hull identification number indicating a home built status. We believe at some point there may have been a change in ownership. We've not been able to prove that, and basically they're either the importer and or the individual who registered, but it may have been accomplished basically to bypass that issue with the Secretary of State. So there were documents filled out that the other individual had purchased. So now we end up with 4 kit and or assembled vessels that were imported from China with assigned hull identification numbers and state registrations. And the individuals put those vessels into a livery type or charter or lease arrangement within our area of operation, the Detroit River system and or Lake St. Clair. So once those vessels were put into service, we really didn't know too much about it until CJIS had pushed it along to us. And we started looking into it a little bit more, and through some querying with Intel and working with the Michigan Secretary of State and the DNR detectives, determined that these individuals were indeed leasing these vessels out and had advertised on multiple different websites for having them leased out. So we know there was use. We're not sure how much use. However, CJIS did obtain that an individual had allegedly been ejected from one of these vessels. So when we reviewed the vessel documentation, it's obviously unclear, and it's translated from Chinese to English, and it states that the vessels can be operated on inland waterways and rivers and can be sped about. It doesn't go into any of the stability factors or any of the other items that may be covered for a facility that would have a manufacturer identification code. So the Michigan detective with state of Michigan came to us and essentially said, look, we believe that these have been fraudulently registered and or assigned hull identification numbers. And we've requested through the Secretary of State to have these registrations invalidated. So we attempted to work with the state and provide them along. So we contacted BSX. We worked with our district legal office, and we, through the captain of the port, drafted a letter to the Secretary of State after request, outlining why these vessels should not be leased or rented out, and we believe that they were improperly registered and assigned hull identification numbers. After some length, we finally did receive a reply from the Secretary of State, the state of Michigan, basically stating that they do not have the authority to cancel the registration as they do not regulate or monitor watercraft usage once registration is completed. So essentially, we made a mistake and we assigned these. However, once it's assigned, it's assigned. So that left us with an interesting issue of usage of these vessels, because like I mentioned, we did believe that an individual had been ejected from one of these vessels, and it was likely going to result in some obvious safety concerns. So what we did was, working with BSX and District Legal, we looked at the regulatory requirements as the vessels were assigned. So as the vessels were assigned hull identification numbers with a home built status, however fraudulent or otherwise, with the state not allowing appropriate registration and or identification, we said, well, then if indeed they're assigned home built status, then they can only be operated by the individual owner who manufactured or put together the vessel as home built. So because of the obvious safety concerns and the way that they were registered and or assigned all identification numbers, what we did was issued captain of port orders to all 4 vessels, essentially stating that based on the registration and or hull identification number assignment, the vessels can no longer be used in any kind of commercial capacity. And that would include lease or library charter type use of the vessels, and essentially could only be used by the owner of the vessels for their own personal recreational use. So that's essentially how we've handled it thus far. We're still waiting a letter back from the state. I think BSX was going to draft some documentation and send it out to the state as the assigning authority and ask some of those additional questions about what can we do to get a new hull identification number assigned. This is the appropriate path to inspection, etc. They had every intention of being deceptive. And what occurred was, it started with the purchase. This guy used his daughter's LLC to make the purchase of the vessels. And then from there, essentially found a guy at the marina and had him do the work and said, hey, look, I'll sign these boats over to you. And this is all recorded through the detective, but I'll assign these boats over to you. You go into the Secretary of State, tell them this and get them registered, and then we'll operate together and work together. Interestingly enough, when we went to do the captain of port orders, the captain of the port wants to ensure that it's going to the right place. In this circumstance, we wrote 2 separate sets of captain of port orders because we couldn't figure out who the actual owners of the boats were. So we wrote them to the original purchaser and to this other guy who had went to the Secretary of State and attempted to, well, he did register and get hull identification number assignment. So we wrote them to both parties. The guy that went in and received hull identification numbers and is on the documentation now as the owner accepted the captain of port orders. The other guy wouldn't come to the door and basically refused to sign any of the captain of port orders, the original importer. So he knows what he's doing, and he's trying to push himself back away from this. They would have to meet the standards, and that was, I think, the main point initially was that they were not imported through a facility bearing a manufacturer identification code that could have assigned that hull identification number. That was, in my opinion, and the state's detective's opinion, was knowingly bypassed. They knew what they were doing. If it would have went, the interesting thing was we did a query when we found these, and we kind of said, well, if they're in Detroit, they're likely in other parts of the Great Lakes. And we reached out to other areas around the Great Lakes, and indeed we found these type of vessels operating in different ports on the Great Lakes. However, they had been imported through a facility that could examine and look at and build out the boats in entirety. And I don't know if they came from the same manufacturer or not, but they were appropriately assigned PIN numbers through a facility having a manufacturer identification code. As far as we know, there are no other boats like this on the Great Lakes that bypass that facility. I do know that we talked to Miami though, and they're so busy that they can't even keep up with. They know they're operating and it's likely occurring. They just don't have the bandwidth to keep up with running these to ground.
Our next speaker is Clay Crabtree from the National Marine Manufacturers Association, and he is going to talk about the legal implications of importing boats.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to join you today on behalf of the National Marine Manufacturers Association, which is the nation's leading trade association for the recreational boating industry. It's a uniquely American-made industry with 95% of the boats that are sold in the U.S. are built right here in the U.S., and that has about a $230 billion impact on the economy. In fact, NMMA represents over 1,300 marine manufacturing members, and our member companies produce more than 80% of all boats, engines, trailers, accessories, and all the gears that you see that are used by millions of boaters across North America. Now, as a leading certification body for the recreational boating industry in the United States, NMMA's certification impacts the recreational marine industry worldwide. It helps to improve boat manufacturing and ensure quality products for consumers throughout the world. And our global team of inspectors have extensive knowledge of the marine industry with expertise ranging from manufacturing to operations, engineering, and quality assurance. And they're well versed in both the domestic and international standards. Now, our certification program at NMMA, we use ABYC standards, which provides an additional level of safety that goes above and beyond the U.S. Coast Guard requirements. Now, NMMA certification also serves as evidence that a manufacturer followed the required safety protocols and guidelines. With all that being said, NMMA is very concerned about illegally imported boats and the potential effect that it could have undermining our world-class products here in the U.S. Our manufacturers, they must meet strict safety, design, and technological requirements. And so not only does that undermine us in the U.S., it can undermine our global export markets as members' products are sought all over the world. We very much appreciate the attention that this issue is being given during this session. We're going to continue looking forward to working with our federal partners, whether that is with the Coast Guard, Customs, Border Protection, also, state governments as well, to better enforce the guidelines that are in place and identify, are there potential solutions to help reduce the number of illegally imported boats that are in the marketplace. Now, NMMA will continue raising this issue with key policymakers as we have been doing, and this is to improve policies and laws that are already in place. Can we look at making improvements to those policies as well to not only support our manufacturers' world-class products, but to be able to protect boaters, consumers in the U.S. from illegally imported boats? Now, if you're new to boating and looking to buy a boat, certainly you want to make sure that your boat is NMMA certified, because with NMMA certification, our manufacturers who build those products, they go above and beyond what is required by the Coast Guard, and this is to the latest safety and technological requirements that are going to ensure that your product is made at a very high level, the highest level there can be, to ensure that you and your family have a fun and safe time out on the water.
Thank you so much to our speakers and to the audience for sticking with us. We hope the viewers have gained a new appreciation for the problem of illegally imported boats and are thinking of ways to increase recreational boating safety by reducing the number of illegally imported boats in the United States. The Coast Guard is open to any suggestions to address this problem. If you had an idea, please email us at rbscompliance.mil. We will now have a few minutes for a live Q&A session with our speakers.